The first reports emerged not from laboratories, but from quiet pastures. In the mid-18th century, a Pennsylvania farmer watched his strongest ox stumble, then collapse in a field of tall, broad-leafed plants. The animal's sides heaved with shallow breaths. Within hours, it was dead. Other settlers across the colonies began connecting similar losses, their cattle dying after grazing in overgrown meadows. They examined the aftermath. In the stomachs of the fallen animals, they found masses of tough, fibrous leaves. The common thread was a sticky white sap that oozed from any broken stem, a milky latex that stained their hands. This was the plant the Lenape people called milkweed. The farmers noted it grew thickest along fence lines and in neglected corners where their livestock, searching for tender shoots, would inevitably encounter it. Word of the mysterious cattle killer spread through almanacs and farmers' journals. A pattern solidified. Illness struck not randomly, but only after herds had fed in certain pastures. The culprit was not a blight or a fever, but a specific native plant. This was the first documented link between the seemingly harmless milkweed and sudden, unexplained death in the grazing animals of colonial North America. The scattered farmyard observations of the previous century now coalesced into a focused scientific inquiry. Botanists like Constantine Rafinesque and physicians across the eastern United States began systematically collecting specimens and reports. They interviewed farmers, examined sick animals, and pressed the broad leaves between sheets of paper, noting the plant's milky latex stained their fingers. Their goal was to transform rural anecdote into documented fact, to understand precisely how this common plant turned lethal. In makeshift field clinics and university dissecting rooms, the symptoms were meticulously recorded. A sheep, having grazed in a milkweed patch, would first stagger. Its flanks would heave with strained, rasping breaths, as if the air had thickened. Then the tremors began, a violent shivering that started in the hindquarters and seized the entire body. Observers timed the decline, noting how the animal's pulse fluttered, grew faint, and lost its steady rhythm before the final collapse into stillness. The compiled casebooks painted a clear, grim portrait of the poisoning sequence. Labored breathing, muscle tremors, and cardiac failure were the consistent triad. The physicians deduced the toxin was not attacking the gut, but something deeper, the very machinery of life. The plant's milky sap, they theorized, carried a poison that somehow paralyzed the muscles, including the heart, explaining the weak and irregular pulse that always preceded death. The mechanism remained a mystery, but the clinical picture was now unmistakable. The symptoms described by those early physicians, the labored breath, the erratic pulse, pointed toward the heart. In the 1840s, chemists in dim European laboratories turned their attention to the dried, crumbled leaves shipped from across the Atlantic. They began the meticulous work of extraction, dissolving the plant material in solvents, searching for the specific agent behind the poisonings. From that bitter brew, they isolated a crystalline compound. Under the microscope, it was inert, yet its power was immense. They classified it as a cardiac glycoside, a molecule with a precise and deadly target. This toxin did not attack randomly. It sought out the microscopic machinery within every heart muscle cell, the sodium-potassium pump that maintained the vital electrical rhythm of life. The toxin acted like a molecular key, binding to that pump and jamming it shut. With the pump frozen, potassium flooded out of the cell while sodium surged in, scrambling the electrical signals. The heart muscle, deprived of its steady beat, began to quiver, a fatal arrhythmia. The mystery of the field deaths was now a matter of atomic interference, a chemical sabotage written in the very cells of the heart. As chemists identified the precise toxins in their laboratories, a new breed of professional emerged in the countryside. The late 19th century veterinarian arrived at a farm not with folk remedies, but with a leather-bound manual. He would flip past pages of detailed botanical engravings, Asclepias syriaca, its broad leaves and clustered flowers rendered in precise cross-hatching, to show the farmer exactly what to look for. These manuals transformed scattered observations into systematic warnings. They explained that the danger peaked in late summer, when the milkweed stood tall and lush in pastures gone dry and brittle. Hungry cattle, their usual forage withered, would turn to the abundant green plant, consuming a fatal dose of cardiac glycosides before a herdsman could intervene. The advice was practical and grimly seasonal. Farmers learned to walk their fields in August, identifying the culprit before the first animals stumbled. Prevention became a calendar event, tied to the sun-bleached grass and the swelling of the milkweed's seed pods. Knowledge, once locked in academic journals, was now a tool for survival in the barnyard. As the new century dawned, the knowledge of milkweed's danger had crystallized into official policy. County agricultural agents across the Great Plains began distributing starkly printed bulletins to every ranch and farmstead. These documents carried the weight of government science, translating decades of tragic observation into clear, actionable warnings for the men who worked the land. The advice was specific and visual. Agents instructed ranchers to walk their pastures in late summer, to identify the dense stands of milkweed with its clusters of dusty pink flowers. Where the plant grew thickest, they were to roll out barbed wire and posts, creating exclusion zones. It was a physical barrier against an invisible threat, a new chore born from old losses. The bulletins emphasized that vigilance was most critical during drought years. When the prairie grasses browned and shriveled under a relentless sun, hungry cattle would lower their heads and chew anything green. A fenced-off thicket of milkweed, they warned, could mean the difference between a healthy herd and a string of sudden, shuddering deaths in the parched field. The bulletins from the extension services had warned of this exact scenario. Then the Dust Bowl descended, and the warnings became prophecy. For years, the topsoil of the Great Plains lifted into the sky, leaving behind a barren, cracked earth. Cattle, ribs pressing against their hides, wandered pastures stripped of nutritious grass. Their desperation drove them to the only green thing left standing in many fields, the coarse, fibrous stalks of milkweed. In the searing heat of a Kansas summer, a rancher surveyed a field of tragedy. Several of his steers lay motionless in the dust. Kneeling beside one, he pried open its jaw. The animal's mouth was stained with the plant's telltale milky sap. When local veterinarians performed necropsies, they found the rumens packed tight with undigested leaves, a grim testament to the cattle's final, frantic meals. The veterinary reports from Oklahoma and Kansas painted a consistent, horrifying picture. The cardiac glycosides, those potent compounds isolated a century prior, had done their work. The toxins overwhelmed the animals' hearts, causing the weak, irregular pulses and laboured breathing earlier manuals had described. In the absence of any other forage, the milkweed that had sustained monarchs for millennia became, for the livestock, a fatal last resort. The dust had barely settled from the war when a new chemical arsenal arrived on American farms. Tanks of 2,4-D and other synthetic herbicides rolled into fields that spring, their nozzles spraying a fine mist over the earth. For the first time, farmers could systematically target broadleaf weeds like milkweed without harming their corn or soybeans. They saw it as liberation from a centuries-old threat to their livestock, a final solution to the plant that had killed their grandfathers' cattle. Across the Midwest, the chemical campaign transformed the landscape within a single growing season. Where once milkweed's pink clusters had dotted fence lines and field margins, now there were only neat rows of crops stretching to the horizon. Farmers celebrated cleaner fields and safer grazing. They didn't yet notice the quiet absence, the missing caterpillars that should have been stripping leaves, the orange and black butterflies that no longer fluttered between the stalks. This eradication was driven by dual motives: protecting crops from competition and eliminating a documented poison. Agricultural bulletins still carried warnings about milkweed's cardiac glycosides, so the spraying continued year after year, creating an agricultural monoculture that was safer for cows, but increasingly hostile to monarchs. The very efficiency of modern chemistry had unwittingly severed a migratory lifeline that stretched from Canada to Mexico. The chemical identity of the poison was now clear, but its real-world danger remained a question of dosage and circumstance. To answer it, toxicologists in the 1970s moved from the field report to the controlled laboratory. They designed experiments where sheep, penned in research stations, were fed precise amounts of harvested milkweed. The goal was to map the exact relationship between the plant consumed and the body's collapse. Inside the pens, technicians monitored each animal's vital signs. They discovered a critical variable: the plant's life stage. Sheep, given freshly cut green milkweed, developed the classic symptoms: the stumbling gait, the laboured breath, the erratic heartbeat, far more rapidly and severely than those fed dried, weathered clippings. The sap, it seemed, held its potency only until it began to desiccate. The studies revealed another layer of complexity. Not all milkweeds were created equal. Feeding trials compared species like the common Asclepias syriaca with others like swamp milkweed. The toxicity, measured in the milligrams of cardiac glycoside per kilogram of plant material, could differ by orders of magnitude. A rancher's risk depended not just on the presence of the plant, but on precisely which one was growing in his pasture. While toxicologists had mapped the poison's mechanics in the lab, the story of milkweed was moving beyond the farm. By the 1980s and 90s, a new voice entered the conversation. Conservation biologists, tracking the alarming decline of the monarch butterfly, pointed to a startling fact. This toxic plant was the sole food source for the iconic insect's caterpillars. This revelation sparked a gardening movement. Homeowners, hoping to aid the butterflies, began planting ornamental milkweed in suburban flower beds and community gardens. Yet these cultivated patches introduced the toxin into an entirely new environment. Curious dogs, nibbling on leaves during a backyard romp, and horses reaching over a paddock fence found themselves the latest victims of an ancient poison. Veterinary clinics started seeing cases that echoed the old farm reports, but with different patients. A family dog would stagger home, its mouth frothing, heart racing erratically after chewing on a garden plant. The diagnosis was the same: cardiac glycoside poisoning. The plant once cleared from fields to protect livestock was now being deliberately cultivated, creating a new suburban front in its long history of toxicity. The gardener's hands, still dusty from pulling weeds, gently parted the milkweed's broad leaves. She was checking for monarch caterpillars, their black, yellow and white stripes a sign of success. This patch in her suburban yard was part of a continent-wide effort, a tiny fortress planted to save a vanishing migration. Yet the same milky sap that coated her fingers held the same chemical weapons that had felled cattle for generations. Across the country, a veterinary toxicologist clicked through a digital database. An entry for Asclepias syriaca, common milkweed, flashed on the screen. The clinical signs listed were precise and unchanged from 19th century farm ledgers: weakness, stumbling, irregular heartbeat leading to cardiac arrest. The file was cross-referenced with recent cases: a curious foal in Virginia, a dog in Colorado, proving the threat was not historical but current. The contradiction was rooted in the plant itself. Its cardiac glycosides, evolved as a defense against herbivores, were a death sentence for livestock, but a survival tool for monarchs. The caterpillars sequestered the toxins, making themselves poisonous to birds. So the gardener nurtured a poison, and the toxicologist documented a hazard, both interacting with the same ancient, unchanging chemistry in a modern world.